And here we go. Prologue. It had been made in the fires of a Siran volcano. The metal mined from that volcano melted into dark liquid and was poured into the form that would only be used this one time. Only the Siran volcano had fires hot enough to make this possible. Once the blade had its rough form, the blacksmiths picked up their hammers and started working. The sound of metal clashing onto metal echoed in the cave, sounding day and night. They took turns in working it, hammering it into its final shape. And still it took more than pure manpower to do this. The blacksmith's hammers glowed with every strike, sparking when they met the blade. Once the metal blade cooled down and lost its glow, it started to shimmer in black, a pure, perfect black that seemed to radiate darkness and swallow all the light shining upon it. The other smiths had finished their work. Hilt, handle, and pommel, all formed out of one piece of dark metal, were put into the shape of a flying dragon, with its head making out the pommel and a mouth wide open, biting with sharp teeth at its owner. It was a warning. Whoever would yield it had to be ready to pay the price. The wings of the dragon formed the hilt, ready to take and block any blow that would come from another sword or other weapon. The scaly body was wrapped in thin leather, stitched together from one end to the other, giving it the only splash of color this entire weapon would have, even though it was only a very dark brown. An inhuman shout from one of the blacksmiths, a deep growling and angry voice bellowing it into the deepest corners of the big cave, announced that the blade was ready. One smith picked it carefully up, like it was part of his own soul, and carried it to the final anvil that was standing in the middle of a stone circle surrounded by flowing lava. Another one from the other end of the cave brought the handle. They placed both parts of the sword on the anvil and looked at the two hooded figures standing left and right of it. One figure gave it a small nod, only visible by the movement of its hood and cloak. The blacksmiths understood and brought both pieces together. The lower end of a black blade slid into the opening that had been left in the handle. A metallic sound announced that it fit in perfectly. They placed it back on the anvil and made 2 steps back each. Respectfully, even a bit afraid, they turned their attention towards the hooded figures, who raised their hands above their hooded heads, and started to mumble. The blacksmiths did not understand this language, but it didn't bother them. They had done their part. Now the hooded figures would do theirs. But suddenly they felt it. The air was filled up with power, flowing through the cave. They could hear it. They could hear it hum in their ears, while their skin was basically burned and singed from centuries of blacksmith work felt like tingling. It gave them shivers. The ground felt uneasy, ready to quake at any moment. Almost as if they had expected a quake, a bunch of rocks came loose from the cave wall and rolled downwards till they came to a halt on the dusty floor. A bolt of lightning flashed and struck the sword in the middle, right where the blade and handle had come together. Light and darkness came over it at the same time, wrestling against each other. The hum of the magic energy turned into a thunderstorm. The blacksmiths who were witnessing this event turned away and fled for their lives. One tripped over a rock and fell into the lava stream. He went down without a sound, never to be seen again. Light and dark battled on, using the sword as their battleground, seemingly pushing against each other, measuring their strength, until both were absorbed by the blade which still radiated darkness, but now had also a shimmer of its own light on it, and the storm ended. Both figures lowered their hands again and finally took off their hoods. One of them did it with an audible sigh of relief. "We did it," he exclaimed. brushing over his long grey beard and grasping an amulet hanging around his neck, that resembled the sun and was made out of pure gold. The other one looked at him through red eyes and smiled in a somewhat sinister way. Indeed, he only said. Then his glance went over to the completed sword, admiring its shape, its glow, an admiration that was in no way shared by the first one. Distrustful, the first one looked at him. Blue eyes were shining in this old face, a sign of unmeasurable power. Remember our agreement, he demanded. I have never been here, and we will never cross paths again. The look from the red eyes met his blue glance. I will honor this. You have made the right choice to come here. That remains to be seen. As the first one turned around to leave the cave, the second one looked at the sword again. It was tempting. The other had his back on him, wouldn't expect it in the slightest, and it would be a great win for their side. Alas, it would not work. He sighed, disappointed. The sword was not made for any of them to wield it. There had to be another way. Shall the humans deal with this their way? At least he will enjoy sitting back and watch the carnage. That is the end of the prologue. I hope you enjoyed it so far. Um, I got just a message from Glottas. He will not make it. Okay, I see. Well, any questions, any comments so far, or everything clear? I guess, yeah. No. If you have any questions, just type them in the chat and I will answer them as soon as I can. Then we will just get on with part 1. Just an explanation for anyone who hasn't dealt with this book before. This book is split up into many parts. They more or less function like the episodes of a TV show. So each part has its own contained plot, but all parts together make up for the entire story. So this is one journey with basically several steps or several stations, so to speak. So the first one is just one in itself contained story, which is one part of a bigger story. So this is part 1. Your journey will take you to places where people need your help. They may not ask for your help. They might act like they don't want your help, but in the end, they will need it. And you will be able to help them. For all the things you learned in life will help you make a difference, and you will know when to use them. Just be yourself, a kind and caring soul, and be there for others when you know they need you. And in return, some might even help you. Going on to chapter 1, The River. Soaking wet, gasping for air, her limbs all worn out from the struggle, the young woman was just glad to be alive. She was lying on the ground, with the waves gently rushing 2 feet away from her to the shore. Her long wet hair clinged to the side of her head like her soaked tunic and pants clinged to her body. Her feet were swimming in her boots. Everything was dripping. Her clothes felt so heavy, like she was nailed to the ground, but it was just the fatigue of her muscles keeping her from rising up. She slowly began to gather her senses and tried to bring order to the cares in her mind that made up the last few minutes of her life. It all happened so fast, with barely enough time to realize it, and suddenly she had been in the water, swimming for her life, going under, and suddenly getting pulled out by a strong hand in an armored glove. The sudden pain in her arm from this brutal yank was meaningless to the endless relief she felt when her head rose above the water surface again, allowing her to breathe air. For a moment she had believed that she would drown and this were to be the end of her. When she felt strong enough to do so, she turned her head to the right and saw that one other person lying next to her, also breathing heavily. The person that had saved her life for the umpteenth time right now. Don't even think about thanking me, the tall, muscly, steel-clad figure next to her with the long braided hair growled under her breath. Hoyeka managed to smile even in that situation. Then she thought, why wouldn't she smile? They were alive, together, and they just had escaped like a what seemed like a hopeless situation. They even had their possessions, even if they were a little bit wet by now. Thank you, she then told her companion, knowing perfectly well how much this annoyed the other woman. She did so with a grin. Her companion groaned, but said nothing to it. They kept resting for a while. When Royeka raised her head to look back at the river, she saw a lot of bubbles raise from one certain spot. She shivered, and it was not because of cold water or the cold wind. She stared at it for a while, hoping that someone would emerge from the water at that spot, but at the same time feared that someone did. But it didn't happen. Apart from the bubbles that even decreased over time, nothing rose from the depths of the river there. She shivered again. Now she realized that she was freezing. We need to get going, her companion decided. She rose up from the ground, put her long sword back into the sheath on her hip, and helped Rorika stand up again. If we stay out there, we will freeze to death. But where? Oyeka wasn't even finished asking that question before the other woman had turned her back on her and started walking into the dark. The sun had the sun had set a while ago. Sorry, just a second. Okay. The sun had set a while ago. It was the time of chirping crickets, howling wolves, and cold nightly winds. And Royeka could barely see a thing, especially not where her companion was headed. Marvella, where are you going? But Marvella had only taken a few steps before stopping again. As if she was reminded of something, she checked her other weapon. The small hand crossbow seemed a bit roughed up, but it was still in good enough shape to work properly. Charol come, was the short answer. When Royeka looked at her puzzled, Marvella explained. It's a small village not far from here. We stopped there once with the army. They have not much, but the tavern might give us a place to rest for the night. A tavern? Royeka frowned. You think this is a good idea to go there after what happened? Marvella smiled. Believe me, hardly anyone gets mugged in a tavern. It's bad for the owner and the regular guests. And what happened on the ferry doesn't mean it happens to us all the time. She got a lot she got a lot more serious when she added, and our bedrolls are soaking with river. You need a much better rest than a fireplace and a wet bedroll can offer. The tone with which the warrior spoke amused Royaka. At times like these, Marvella sounded just like her mother, acted like her too, or her big sister. They had been friends since earliest childhood, even though they basically had nothing in common. Royaka had been a quiet, curious child who never saw herself as weak, but thought of her way with people as her greatest strength. Marvella, on the other hand, was strong, raised by a warrior father and a big brother who had been eager to join the army and serve the king. She had been trained in all sorts of combat. And whenever Royeka was teased and bothered by the local boys for just being a girl, Marvella had stood up for her, getting into fistfights and teaching all those boys a lesson. She did everything to defend her friend, even went up against overwhelming numbers. She had never understood why Marvella, of all people, had taken such liking to her. But Marvella had told her that she didn't have to. It was her way, and she said that Oyeka had paid her back time and time again just for being as loyal a friend to her as Mavella was to Oyeka. It was as simple as that, especially in that one night during their childhood, the night that changed Oyeka's life forever. She realized that Mavella was looking at her impatiently, waiting for her to come in. Impatiently, but still in friendship. "You will never stop looking out for me, will you?" she asked, amused. Surprisingly, Mavella tilted her head. "I might. Perhaps one day, when you finish studying magic, have become the most powerful sorceress in the world, and start looking out for me instead." She gave her a little nod in the direction of their destination, and they finally started walking. "I am looking out for you," Oyeka stated after a few steps. "I know," Mavella answered without hesitation. They went on in silence. Only once Oyeka turned back and looked at the river again. It was quiet and peaceful, as if their latest encounter never had happened. Then her gaze turned to the horizon. Everything around her was dark, but there was something beyond the edge of her sight, a darkness that was more terrifying than the darkest night. She couldn't even see it, but she felt it in her soul. It had been following them from the moment they had fled their home village and had lost everything, except the purpose. Lurking in the distance, the darkness was a constant reminder that they should not stop. There was only one way for them: onward. As if the urgency with which her magic goddess had bestowed this quest upon her wasn't enough, Hoeka shook her head. Why her, of all people? Why did Elster send her to search his legendary sword? She couldn't even wield a weapon. And why was this darkness, or what it contained, so hell-bent on chasing her down and destroying everything she loved? She clearly had no chance in that matter. She was pushed towards it by forces beyond any control. Mavella led on with heavy steps in reinforced steel boots, which made her steps even heard even in the tall grass that they were hiking on. The sound reminded Oyeka of the here and now, so she turned her attention back to her way forward. At least she didn't have to do this on her own. As she went on, she wondered what would wait for her at the next destination. And this is the end of chapter 1. So, yeah, let's go on to chapter 2. Let's see how far we'll go tonight. Maybe, well, we have 20 minutes in. I might be able to finish the entire first part. Let's see. Chapter 2: The Village. It took the two women about an hour until they saw the distant light of a settlement. On her way from the river, a stream called Uruf that crossed these lands in the east, just to flow south into the grand ocean, they had come across meadows, barren fields, and the ruins of a burnt-down farmhouse. The fields had not been worked on for years now, and even in the dark they looked like it. Mavella was a bit surprised by that. Even though the war against their kingdom had come to a halt, there was still enough need for food that every bit of farmland should have its use. She looked at it from the perspective of a soldier. Raising farmland was a preferred tactic of enemy armies when they invaded their land, taking away resources, leaving the people and soldiers to starve. Maybe they could even convince settlements like small villages to join their cause if they promised to supply them with everything they needed. Mavella had always detested that sort of tactic. Fighting the enemy on the battlefield was one thing, and it was ugly enough, but making innocent people suffer for it was unbearable. Her captain, with whom she had gone to war, had a similar approach to that. When in enemy lands, they had treated the peasants with politeness and respect, honorably and honestly. Something like this would have never happened under their command. But maybe this was not caused by the wars. This place was too far up north to be raided to being raided by enemy war parties. If they had made it from the south to this place, they would have rather turned west, went for the harbors and trading posts, rather than farmland and simple villages. And even if they had taken this route, the Uruf would have been a major obstacle that an army cannot simply cross. They would have had to make use of a few ferries that did business on every other mile up and down the river. Enough time for the king to gather his troops and fight them back on territory they couldn't ever hope to control. Sourly, Mavella thought back to their journey so far. The Uruf had one less ferry now, thanks to Rijeka. Well, thanks to the pirates that had jumped them on the ferry trying to rob them, if not worse. Mavella had done the fighting, trying to push them back, wounding and killing about half of them. But it had been Rijeka and her magic turning the tide in this battle. The things she was able to do with her powers never ceased to amaze Mavella. It was even a little scary. Mavella had seen a lot in her days. She knew of magic, had seen its effect with her own eyes before. Their army had employed several sorcerers, mostly because of their ability to destroy entire legions just with a few words and hand gestures. She had seen fire and lightning raining down on the enemy, seen fireballs shooting out of the hands of sorcerers, seen swords and axes made of finest steel crumble to dust by a touch of them. And when she had witnessed it, she was glad that the enemy did not have such a power on their side. Their greatest enemy, the Yazirians from the south, had waged this war against them just because they feared this magic. They would never think of using it themselves. And the Trogs? Well, they were too stupid to understand it, let alone wield it. They fought humans just because they were different. But after all she had seen and experienced, Mavella was both terrified and astonished that her best friend, the little innocent Rijeka that she had grown up with, this bright-eyed girl with long brown pigtails and an always curious-looking face, who sat by the fire with her and listened to the tales of the elders with her mouth open, that this Rijeka had turned into a woman with the powers to wield such magic herself. She had heard the stories, and Rijeka had told her a lot about this, even had tried to explain a few things. But she hadn't really believed in it, until Rijeka had used those powers to sink the ferry and all their attackers on it. They kept walking, and the distant lights soon turned out to be a small and cozy-looking village. A few simple shacks had been erected at the edge of the village, inhabited by pig and cattle farmers with little to call their own. The closer they came to the center, the more elaborate the houses became. A market stand that was closed at this time of night faced away from the largest building in the middle of the settlement. It was the tavern that Mavella had mentioned earlier, the one that she knew from her army days already. The sign swung in a light breeze and creaked with every move. It said, "Wolf's Refuge." Mavella smiled. Charol Kam, the name of the village, meant the same in a different language. It was the late year, and winter was coming, so the tables and benches right outside the tavern were empty. At this time of night it was too cold outside, so everyone would just gather inside around the hearth fire, sharing their warmth, as well as their tales, while they filled up their bellies with meat, bread, and beer, or whatever was served here. Mavella preferred water. Keeping a clear head gave her an advantage over most warriors who thought that their brawn made all the difference. But she knew that Rijeka wouldn't say no to a good mug of wine, and she needed that more than she needed a rest. What happened on the river had shaken Rijeka to the ground, even more so because she caused it. Mavella knew her well enough to know what was going in her mind right now. Before they would enter the tavern, Mavella looked around at this place attentively. She couldn't help but evaluating it under a tactical point of view, viewing all possible entries and exits, possible traps and dead ends, and all the ways potential attackers might be coming from. It was a recall to her life as a soldier, and it had been both a savior and a curse to her. Now that the only lives she was responsible for were Rebecca's and her own, she still wouldn't find herself relaxing in the slightest. But if anything, their experience on the ferry had proven that she was right to be that way. One thing could be said about Shah Rukh Khan. It was unremarkable. Nobody would ever bother with those few houses in the middle of nowhere. It produced enough to sustain itself and maybe trade with other villages, and the market stand looked like it had frequent customers. But it wasn't rich or anything. Travelers mostly came here by accident, or if they wanted to get away from things. If Mavella had been part of an enemy army, riding with her war band through this place, she wouldn't even have bothered to stop once, let alone putting in the effort to light a torch and set it on fire, not even if she had been that vile. Royaka seemed really happy to be in a place with houses and hearth-fires again, but she still hesitated to approach the tavern. Some laughter could be heard from the inside, and the small windows showed that there was a small crowd in there. For Mavella it was such a tempting sight, but she could understand that her friend was anxious about this. On the other hand, she saw the young woman shiver and pulling her cape tighter around her body, even though it was still damp and reeked of the river. They couldn't just stand out here forever. Come on, Royaka. She tried to sound comforting and assuring. They won't bite you. Royaka tried to smile, but it couldn't hide her anxiety very well. Steve, there. What am I doing here? Well, now you can see how much I'm cursing when I'm reading for the audiobook because, yeah, I'm reading something and my mind is turning into gibberish. How does this fucking work? Okay, let's try it again. Royaka tried to smile, but it couldn't hide her anxiety very well. Still, even she agreed that they didn't have much choice. All right then. With a final look to their surroundings, still expecting, or at least seeing the possibility that someone would attack them out of the dark, Mavella went first, opened the door to the tavern by pushing it gently, and stepped in. Royaka followed her on her heels. So, no questions so far as I can see. Let's continue. Chapter 3 The Tavern. When the two women entered, all the voices in the tavern died down. Everybody was staring at those new people coming in. Mavella didn't like it. Out of pure instinct, she had her hand on the handle of her sword, a strong steel knightly blade, forged by one of King Alok's best blacksmiths. That, and the fact that she was wearing fine steel armor with a king's crest on it, might have been the reason she had the attention of everyone. Yet nobody said a word, like nobody dared to. Or maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was the fact that Royaka, just behind her, coming in and giving a relieved sigh because she finally had a chance to warm up, wasn't carrying any weapon at all. It reminded Mavella a bit too much about their situation on. It reminded Mavella a bit too much of their situation on the ferry, and she remembered that Royaka at one point during their journey had asked whether someone had painted a huge target on their backs. It wasn't like that, but it wouldn't have made any difference. Two traveling women, one of them unarmed, had to look like easy pickings, especially if they looked anything like them. Mavella didn't care much for her looks, except for her long hair that she braided so it wouldn't get in her way in combat. She preferred armor to fancy clothing or jewelry. She didn't smile that much. Actually, hardly ever. She didn't even wash her face as often as many women did. And her body, more muscular than aesthetically pleasing, seemed to show at every single second that she was ready to fight or defend herself. Nothing that would suggest any male who still had all his marbles that she was the kind of woman to foolishly invite for a drink and hope to get lucky. But then there was Royaka, and Marvella had to admit, and she didn't even feel envious admitting it, Royaka was gorgeous. She wore her brown hair loosely, had it falling over her shoulders in elegant waves, with a hint of gold shining through on one hair out of 100. Her eyes had an icy blue to them, but the looks from them were still warm and welcoming, making anyone feel lucky whom her gaze would find. The once youthful curiosity that had made her eyes bigger to perceive the world, it had been replaced by this world's knowledge and self-confidence. Her smile, with her clean white teeth shining from her slightly tanned face, could brighten up an entire room full of people. She also had the body of a dancer, and she clothed herself simply but elegantly, even to her long blue cape that emphasized her looks more than it hid them. At moments like this, Marvella understood why her friend had picked her first and foremost profession. She felt nervous. The people were still staring at them, as if a horde of trucks had just entered the tavern. But it had been barely 3 heartbeats since they had come in. And as suddenly as they stopped, the noises continued as the patrons in the bar turned back to their usual businesses of drinking and chatting. There were still 1 or 2 people, mostly male, that kept looking at them. Marvella didn't need to look to know that their attention was directed purely at Royeka. She had been through this before. Her friend got this kind of attention, or got this kind of admiration, a lot. They made their way through the crowd and approached the counter, but as they were halfway through, Royaka stopped her friend by grabbing her arm. "We don't have any money," she whispered in Marvella's ear, a frightful look in her eyes. Marvella looked back at her. "What?" That was new to her. "What happened to your purse?" "I lost it when I jumped into the river." Royaka clearly felt terrible for that, but there was nothing they could do about it. Marvella sighed. So much for a warm bed and a meal tonight. Now what? But her companion wasn't giving up so easily. "Wait just a moment. I have an idea. You go over there to the table and to the table in the corner that is still vacant. If you stay here, you'll just scare the patrons." Royaka said this with a tiny little wink in her eyes. Clearly, she was just teasing her at this point. Marvella repaid that with a snort, but left it at that, and did how she was told. But as vigilant as ever, she kept an eye out for Royaka, who then stepped in front of a corner and greeted the man with the apron behind it. "Greetings, my lady. Welcome to Wolf's Refuge." That was all that Marvella could make out of the talk, because Royaka said something quietly and discreetly to the innkeeper. At one point in their silent discussion, she pushed her cape back a little. She didn't wear a weapon. She wouldn't she would never even touch a forged weapon, and for good reason. But at the same spot where Marvella carried her longsword, there was an item at Royeka's hip that meant about the same to her. It was the tool of her own profession, and she wore it and at times wielded it with the same confidence a warrior would wear and wield his weapon. Now she drew it and put it on the counter. The clack of that item made the patrons near her go quiet again. Awfully quiet. Marvella didn't like this at all. Her sword leaned on the table next to her, but she had her hand on the handle again, looking distrustful at the patrons and their reaction. One by one she examined the people present in this room, trying to estimate what kind of danger they could pose. She noticed one person in particular, a man sitting close to the fire with a mug in his hand. She could see part of his face, at least a beard that looked like a goatee, but the rest was obscured by a dark grey hood. He hadn't taken it off in here. That was odd enough. He was also one of the men that kept staring at Rebecca since she had stepped inside. But what caught her eye the most was not the man, but the item leaning right next to him against the wall. It looked like a sword, had the right shape for it, but it was wrapped entirely in cloth and secured with a ribbon. Still, this looked like trouble, more than Marvella could have liked to handle tonight. The hood moved a little, not enough for her to see his eyes, but she had the strange feeling that this man was now looking at her, as if he had felt her glance on him, and he examined her the same way that she did him. But only for a second. Then his gaze returned to Rebecca. By now Rebecca had spoken to the innkeeper, and whatever she had told him, after a few more heartbeats, the innkeeper took up 2 mugs and filled them up to the brink from a large keg that stood behind the counter. When they were full, he passed them on to Rebecca, who now had taken the item she had shown him back and put it in place on her belt again. With 1 mug in each hand, she worked her way towards Marvella. It was easy for her. Everyone respectfully made way for her. "We can stay here for tonight," she announced as she placed the mugs on the table. "He'll have a maid prepare a room for the 2 of us, and we will get something to eat as well." Marvella had always been the one to look a gift horse in the mouth. "And what did you offer him in return?" she asked, fearing for the worst. Rebecca just winked at her. Then she turned away and walked back, right in the middle of the room. The patrons had formed a circle around the spot in the middle, and the innkeeper now raised his voice. "Attention, people! I want to say something to you, so be quiet for a moment, for we are blessed and honored to have a bard among us tonight." Marvella groaned. It was as bad as she had feared. So much for keeping a low profile. On the other hand, she had known her friend for a long time now, and she really should have seen this coming. The previous silence of the patrons was now replaced by a roaring round of applause, as in the meantime Rebecca put herself in position and pulled her treasured item out again. It was a small wooden flute. "My dear fellows," she began, and her voice that always had some sweetness to it, filled the room like honey. It made Marella's skin tingle, although she had heard it time and time again. Still, it was different from the usual way Rebecca talked. It wasn't louder than her normal voice, but it had a sound to it that just went everywhere. It sounded warm, calm, assuring, and yet a bit demanding, too. It was a voice full of promise, of wisdom and experience, full of excitement. The voice, the voice alone promised adventures, astonishing things, and it made clear without any words that all of it came with a price. That price being the undivided attention of everyone listening to it. Just like me right now. Huh? I want to begin this evening with a song that I learned from one of the greatest bards in the kingdom. She even had the great honor to play for the court of King Alox. It is said that this is one of the king's favorite songs. This announcement made the audience mumble and resonate in surprise and awe. The king himself! This had to be a good one. Marvella leaned back and crossed her arms before her. She might as well enjoy it while it lasted. It didn't look like anyone would start something funny in here. Rebecca raised her flute to her lips and blew softly. A fine, almost delicate tone came from the instrument. Immediately the tavern grew as silent as during their entrance, but this time it stayed quiet. All the patrons and the innkeeper were just captivated from the woman in her midst. even though this single tone was just the preparation for the actual performance. Oyeka lowered the flute again and hummed this tone for herself to match it. Marvella remembered that her performance was a craft as well as an art form. At times she wondered if it also involved some kind of magic. And then she began to sing. Marvella's skin started to tingle again with the first note that came from her companion's mouth, and she was pretty sure that most of the patrons in here felt the same way. She couldn't help but being drawn into the song. I'll just read the lyrics. I'm not singing to you. I'm not doing this to you. So the lyrics are: Gather round, good people, and lend me your ear, for the stars smile upon us tonight. Gather round, good people, there's nothing to fear. Keep your mugs filled and your bellies tight. Oyeka's soft and sweet voice felt like a balm, covering everyone and everything, making pain and worries go away. From this moment on, nothing outside this room existed, nothing of consequence at least. There was no fear, just like she sang, and even though Marvella had heard this one before, she still felt that the burden of her journey and the reason for them leaving their home became a little footnote in the smallest corner of her mind. It was replaced with joy, hope, and peace. She wouldn't even think of her sword any more. She just felt like covered with the warmest, softest blanket. Eventually the song ended. The audience thanked her with such a roaring, enthusiastic applause, and Marvella found herself joining in, knowing that this was only the beginning of the evening. But she also believed that the words with which Roika had announced the song had not been entirely true. One of the greatest bards in the kingdom, she thought, and shook her head. There was no greater bard in this kingdom than her. Marvella would bet her honor on that. Chapter 4: The Stranger. But before we continue, just a slight break. I'll be right back. Just a moment. All right, I'm back. Thank you. I like this wording too, Manika. Yeah, yeah. As you can see, this chapter is the very lyrical one, especially when one of the book members commented on how very poetic the description of Oyeka was with her hair and everything else. And yeah, so I hope you get a good picture of the two by now and how different they are. That is the most glaring feature of them, that they are completely polar opposites, more or less. All right then. Um, Chapter 4: The Stranger, as I said before. From this first song on, Oyeka had won over the crowd completely. The mood in this rural tavern had never been better. Yet she continued to give her performance everything she got. Marvella watched her closely. She must have been tired from the long journey, and what they had encountered while crossing the river must have shaken her. But she showed no sign of that. While her performance went on, she sang, played the flute, told stories and jokes. Her one and only priority at this moment was to entertain the people around her, and she did that perfectly. With every part of her performance, the overall mood in the tavern improved, but each part caused a different reaction, and it did so by design. With the first song, Mavella had felt pacified, calm, without any worries. Since then, Hoyeka had sung and played pieces of music that warmed the hearts of the patrons here, but others that invited them to join in singing, and they did so enthusiastically. They bellowed the lines that Hoyeka had taught them just a few moments before the actual song, and they clapped and stomped their feet to the rhythm of it. For this little moment, all the people in this room became one big unit, just singing and stomping together, having a good time. It was more astonishing when Hoyeka played the flute, which was her favorite way of performing. Mavella tended to watch her more closely when she did this, and she observed that her friend closed her eyes while playing, seemingly losing herself in the music. This was basically the only time during her entire performance that she ever closed her eyes. During all the other parts, she kept them open, watching her audience wakefully as they watched her. It had to do with Oyeka's little secret, of which only Mavella really knew. But when, but when she was on the flute, playing her tune, she didn't care for anything else. The music, she had once explained to Mavella, came from her heart, and it was the truest music she could ever play. The audience had been captivated before, but when she played, they were totally taken away by it. Nobody would make a sound, not even a whisper or a cough, not even a loud breath. This must be magic, Mabella thought and shook her head to get her senses back together. Hoyaka's music had an effect on her too, but she had heard and experienced it for a long time now, and she knew that this didn't go for everybody. There had been occasions when thieves would make use of the distraction, filling their pockets by emptying everyone else's. And there could always be people who either didn't like that sort of music or wouldn't be affected by it, so they could put more sinister plans in motion. At times like these, Mavella had gotten used to keep an eye out on the crowd, even more watchfully than before, looking for anything abnormal, like people who didn't seem to listen like the rest of the audience. The man with the dark hood was one of those people. He hadn't joined in doing the sing-along, as Mavella had noticed, and while everyone else was watching Hoyeka play, barely moving, never turning a gaze away from her, he was looking at something else entirely. Like Mavella herself, he seemed to scan the room, looking for something, or watching out for something he was expecting to happen. Throughout the entire performance, his mind seemed to be elsewhere. Also, he had his right hand always near his wrapped item on the wall, like he expected to need it at any given moment. It reinforced Mavella's suspicion that this was a weapon of some sort. Also, he had barely drunk from his mug, although he was holding onto it the whole time. What is he up to? Mavella thought. What is he waiting for? She felt the urge to storm in the middle of a tavern and get Royaka out of here, grab her by the grab her by her cape and drag her if necessary. This was not the time to lower defenses. Not after all they have been through. And whatever this man was up to, it could only mean trouble. Carefully, trying not to raise any more suspicion than she already had, Mavella checked whether her crossbow was ready. If things got ugly in here, maybe she could take the man out with one well-placed shot. But before she could think about it any further, the performance suddenly stopped. As the last song ended, the audience applauded once more, and with a short announcement that she would be back shortly to continue, Royeka moved out of the circle and joined the table. This time she needed a bit longer. The people stopped her, talked to her full of admiration and awe, touched her gently by her shoulder and arm, shook her hand. Mavella knew the routine. It was always the same. It was different in big cities where bards performed more regularly, but it still happened there. In Charol Kam, bardic performances were rarely seen, hence the reaction of the audience was overwhelming. She finally sat down and dropped her act. She looked exhausted. Marvella pushed one of the two mugs over to her, and thankfully she took it and almost emptied it in one sip. Your ideas used to be better, Marvella commented dryly as soon as her friend had settled. Hoyaka shrugged. It is something I can do on short notice, and it gives us drinks, food, and lodging. So what are you complaining about? As if fate wanted to underline this, the barmaid appeared with two big plates of wood. A wooden bowl of steaming hot stew was on each plate, accompanied by what appeared to be a freshly baked pie and some pieces of loose meat. It was still simple food, but quite nice for such a place, and the spoons they got to their meal, with a pointy end on on the other side to pick up the meat, were made out of iron instead of wood. Marvella looked at her cutlery and raised an eyebrow. Quite fancy for this little nothing of a village. Oyaka frowned. Don't say this too loudly in here. These people are proud of their village. She opened her right fist, which she had clenched for some time now, without Marvella even noticing. A bunch of coins slid off her palm onto the table. Some wanted to really show their appreciation for my performance tonight. It would only be appropriate to be nice, or at least play nice in your case. It wasn't much money compared to what they had lost, but it would have been enough to pay for this night in the tavern with drinks and all, hadn't Oyeka paid for it with her performance already. Marvella sighed. She was right, after all. Oyeka was looking out for her as much as the other way round. She took care of Marvella by being there. She took care of Marvella by keeping her from rubbing people off the wrong way. Marvella wouldn't dare to think about how many encounters with the civilized world, outside the army that was, would have ended badly for her if her friend hadn't intervened on her behalf. After all, the battlefield was where Marvella's talents really worked, but outside of it, it was Royaka who was the expert. Excuse me, milady. Marvella was startled at this moment. Damn it, I didn't pay attention. Instinctively she reached for her sword, but Royaka knew this kind of reaction already and stopped her with a hand gesture. Then she slowly turned around and upwards, to the man in the dark hood who had just stepped up to the table. Yes? She asked politely. The man under the hood smiled. Marvella could see it, the lips between the goatee, and she also saw a shadow of his eyes. So far it wasn't such an ugly or sinister face, but that only made it worse. Evil men wouldn't be always recognized as such at first sight. I just wanted to say that I really admired your performance tonight. But may I humbly ask whether you would be willing to do requests, given that you are familiar with the song in question, that is? Well spoken, Marvella thought, a bit surprised. He could have been someone on the king's court with his choice of words. Could be a diplomat or a bard himself. Only that the suspicious item wasn't leaning on the wall any more, but hanging on his belt, still covered. Even the position suggested that it was a sword. Of course, Royaka readily answered without hesitation. Now what song would that be? Excuse me, Marvella interrupted. May I ask who you might be now? She knew that her voice didn't sound very welcoming, but at this point she didn't care. Their safety came first, and this man did not look like good company. But to her surprise, the man wasn't repelled by it. He raised an arm and finally lifted his hood. It surprised her once more to find a normal, almost handsome face under there. Clear green eyes, a long but elegant nose, and smooth light brown skin, like he had spent some time in the South. The goatee was carefully cut and groomed. He didn't have ugly spots or scars on his face that would explain why he hid it. And even his haircut was decent, having his brown hair growing till 1 inch above his shoulders. He could have been a noble. His clothing suggested otherwise as simple as theirs, without any decorative elements. My name is Kane, he then introduced himself. His voice had some rasp to it, but not enough to make it sound unpleasant. He made up for it by talking in a very calm way. I am a traveler. So are you, from the looks of it. This is surely a lucky night for me, being at a place with a bard performing. As he moved his hand, Marvella twitched, her hand going towards her sword again, but he just pulled a small purse from his belt and put it on the table. Well, whether you do this or not, I would like to show you a little token of my gratitude. He turned back to Royaka. The song. Are you familiar with the words of the bard Charon, especially her songs from her Silent Force line? I am. As short as this answer was, Marvella knew that Oyeka was holding back. The bard Charon, from a small kingdom to the west, near the Grand Ocean, was one of the reasons she had wanted to become a bard in the first place. She had sought Charon out and asked her to be her apprentice, and Charon had accepted. Marvella hadn't seen Royeka for 2 years after that, but when her friend returned, she had changed a lot. Still a good friend, but a matured one, experienced in the ways of the world, looking at it with completely different eyes. And of course she knew all the songs. Kane seemed pleased with that. Then I would like to make this humble request to you. When the time is right, would you do me the honor of singing the song for standing one's ground? Even though Marvella wasn't familiar with that title, she suddenly felt that Oyeka's attitude towards the man changed a bit. That's a battle tune, Oyeka remarked, with a warning undertone in her voice. I am aware of that, Kane agreed. I don't expect you to sing it in here tonight in this tavern, but when the time is right, would you be willing to? Oyeka's glance went from his face to Marvella, then to the purse on the table. She hesitated. But then she straightened herself and gave him the answer. When the time is right, I will see what I can do. Not exactly a definitive answer, but Kane seemed to be satisfied with it. That is all I ask for, he said, and slightly bowed before him. Keep the money, please. You have earned it tonight. And he turned around, went back to his place, leaving the two women alone with their dinner. Odd, Marvella commented. But since he was gone, she could finally relax a little and eat. While she had already chewed and swallowed 2 pieces of meat, she noticed that Royaka had barely touched her food. Instead, her bardic friend was staring at the purse, deep in thoughts. Hey, are you all right? Royaka looked at her as if she had woken. Royaka looked at her as if she had just woken up from a dream. Oh, yes, never mind. You're right. It's. She stopped, looked at the purse again. Then she took it and opened it. Her eyes widened as she looked at its content. What is it? Marvella was on alert again. Something was wrong. She could read it in Royaka's face. Royaka showed her the purse and the coins inside. Rongarian silver coins, she said breathlessly. A small fortune of those. She was right, again. Marvella looked at the coins. The purse was halfway full, but the coins in it would have been enough to buy the entire tavern. He has been far to the east, she concluded from this discovery. Very far. And I think this is all the money he has. Oyeka looked over her shoulder at the man who now sat at the table and took a sip from his mug, a small sip, as if he was afraid of getting drunk. What's the song about that he asked you to sing? Marvella asked. If he was paying all he had for this one song, this had to be of some meaning for him. You said that it's a battle tune. What does that mean? It means that bards sing that kind of songs for armies or warriors who are about to start a fight. This particular song is to encourage a warrior who is about to face off against a much stronger opponent, an overwhelming force. It tells them to face it and not run, even when this might cost them their lives. As Marvella heard this explanation, she became aware of the fact that her assumptions had been right. There was some magic to the music that Royaka performed, and each song was supposed to cause a certain reaction in those who listened to it. The songs tonight had been ideal for giving the tavern patrons a good time, but a battle tune like this would change the mood entirely. But that's what Kane said too, at least hinted at. He didn't expect Royaka to perform it in here. When the time is right, they both agreed on that. Will you do it? Marvella asked the one question that was lingering at this table for the entire time. Royaka looked back at Kane. Gods, I hope I won't have to. Chapter 5 The Treasure. Nobody had moved from the spot. They had ordered more drinks and food, and the barmaid was very busy while Marvella and Royaka finished their meal. Nobody had left, not even to relieve themselves. Everybody waited patiently for the bar to continue. While they were waiting, the patrons chatted and discussed things in their usual manner. But whenever that lance would hit the two women at the table, those voices went down to whisper, as if they wouldn't dare getting caught talking about him. Still, it was obvious they were the talk of people tonight. Kane didn't join in that talk. He sat all by himself, slowly drinking. He was still on his first mug, as Marvella noticed. When Royaka picked up again and continued her performance, the program changed a little bit. The first half had been mostly songs and playing the flute, but now that the audience was warmed up from that half, she focused on telling stories and legends. This was the most basic part of a bard's trade, sharing the knowledge of other bards with their audience while also entertaining them. And Royaka was good at that too. When she told stories of heroes and villains, she brought the characters in her tales to life, giving each one a distinct voice and feel. When she spoke of battles, Marvella felt like being taken onto this battlefield, feeling every single word of her friend like a clash of her sword on an enemy shield. She felt the rush, the urgency, the yearning for victory, and she would listen breathlessly until she knew how this all would end. Finally, she announced her last tale for the night. This is a small one, but one with a very important lesson which shall not only educate you all, but foremost your children. It tells of adventure, of bravery, of sorrow. It is a tale no other bard will ever tell you. Marvella stared at her with her eyes wide open. No, she thought, you wouldn't. She wouldn't tell this particular story now, would she? There was once a small village, a little bit like this one. Royaka, don't! Marvella shook her head, trying to catch the look of her friend, but the bard seemed to ignore her completely. This village was home to a few children who decided that one fateful night they would sneak out on an adventure of their own. She couldn't do this. Marvella watched her terrified as the story unfolded before her very eyes. The story wasn't the wor- oh, sorry. The story wasn't the worst part, but the memories that came back with it. They flashed before Marvella's eyes, and she felt it again. The fear, the guilt, the anger. Everything came back, and she couldn't stop or fight it. So when the moon had risen over this village, the children met in the darkness, and the front door was suddenly pushed open, and a young man, almost a boy, hasted into the room. Men are coming, he yelled. On horses, many men. He sounded terrified and had trouble catching his breath. The cold wind that had come in with him was enough to make the half-fire flicker and send cold shivers down Mavella's back. Rebecca frowned as she was so suddenly interrupted, and so was her audience, but within a heartbeat they understood the message. Everyone jumped up, looking for their family and friends, a weapon, or a place to hide. "Who are they?" asked one of the men who had dropped his mark on that sudden entrance. "I don't know," the boy wheezed and gasped fire. "But they look dangerous, like soldiers. They have weapons and armor, and they're coming right here." As Mavella looked onto the crowd, she saw that Royeka finally returned her gaze. Her look spoke louder than her voice ever could. "They found us," they said. Her eyes were full of fear. Mavella understood her well, and she felt with her. At this point she would have loved to take Royeka and get with her to a safe place. But she was a soldier in the royal army, or at least she had been. She couldn't just leave these poor people to their doom. On the other hand, if they had tried and if they left and tried to flee, maybe the soldiers would spare the village. It was more likely that they would give chase and try to hunt the two women down. But they would probably succeed in that. They were on horseback and probably not as tired as the two of them were, and in the dark, in a region that Mavella hardly knew, it would be impossible to find the right way and escape them. Fighting them was their best option, their only option. She realized that she was already stepping forward, her sword in hand, ready to fight. "People, get your children to safety. Anyone who is able to fight will be anyone who is able to fight will be welcome to join me." She gave Royeka another look, one that could hardly be misunderstood, especially since Royeka knew perfectly well what Mavella was on about right now. Whatever happened, she didn't want to see Royeka anywhere near this battle. She should find herself a hiding spot and leave the fighting to Mavella. But it didn't surprise her that Royeka's glance back was disapproving. She wouldn't leave her friend to die out there, not if she was able to do something about it. Then she turned her eyes away, looking for Kane. If he was a swordsman like she thought, he might be of use to them now. But the hooded man was gone. His empty mug was the only thing remaining of him. So he is a coward after all. The other patrons, the ones who hadn't fled to safety, stood in the tavern, some with bats, clubs, or planks of wood in their hands to defend themselves. Not quite an army, Mavella thought, but it was better than nothing. One of them actually had a hatchet, and the innkeeper himself brandished something that looked like an old and bent morning star, with its round head full of ugly metal spikes. Royeka stood amidst those men, sticking out like a gemstone in between rubble, with her hand on the flute that was back on her belt again, almost as if she planned to use her small instrument to defend herself. Everybody was looking at Mavella, expecting her to take command. It didn't surprise her. If nothing else, the royal crest on her armor was to thank for that. "Let's go outside. Keep it together. We shall see what these men want before we start a fight." Reluctant but obedient murmur was the answer. So Mavella checked her hand crossbow and readied it before she stepped outside, with the village people following her and Royeka coming last. She wasn't expecting what she would find out here. The men had arrived, not exactly like the boy had said. Few of them were riding horses, but most of them were on foot. They wore armor, but it was greatly improvised, pieced together from single parts that didn't match, like they had plundered them from dead bodies. They carried swords, maces, and spears. Mavella could see them in the moonlight. The weapons were like their armor, shabby leftovers from battles past, looted by those vultures, and hardly fitting a real army. If they had ever served in an army, then those time had long passed. Those men were out for nothing else but themselves. And now Kane was standing right in front of them. Barely 10 paces separated him from them. He was holding his wrapped item in one hand, presenting it to those men. Kane didn't seem to be aware of Mavella and the village people behind him. Maybe he didn't even care. "I see that Telred delivered the message I gave him," he stated, looking from one man to the next. "That is good. I would have been disappointed otherwise." The first man on the horse, obviously the leader of his band, dismounted and stepped forward towards Kane, looking at him curiously. "You were the one that had come us here." Trio. "You were the one that had us come here," he concluded. "Telred said that the man told him of treasure that could be found here." Mavella could see that this was the leader for two reasons. He was bigger and more muscular than all the other men in this group, and he was wearing by far the best pieces of armor. Even his sword, a two-handed one that he carried on his back, demanded some sort of respect. Next to Kane, he looked like a giant, and Mavella wondered how the hooded man was planning to fight him. "And he was right," Kane confirmed calmly, and then he untied the ribbon and unwrapped his long item. The cloth fell to the ground, and all the men in front of him made one step backwards, except for the leader. He stepped back twice. Mavella looked over Kane's shoulder and saw a silvery shimmer on the hilt of the sword that he was holding. A silvery shimmer that was accompanied by a faint green glow where the pommel was. She had heard the stories, and she understood completely why these men reacted to it like that. "That can't be," she thought. Obviously, the men agreed. "He's a Levi!" one of them uttered, sounding almost panicky. The leader glared at him shortly. "Don't be daft, Nog. He can't be. He's human." As nervous mumbling sounded from the rest of the men, Mavella tried to assess what other weapons they possessed. Most of them had simple weapons for close combat, but she could see two of them equipped with bows and arrows, and two more of them who seemed to hold throwing knives. If a fight was to break out, then those men would attack first, trying to take Kane out. Because if what they said was true, none of them could ever hope to beat him in an honorable combat, one-on-one. But they were right. He was human. It couldn't be true. Or could it? She didn't see Kane's face, but as he spoke again, she really could hear his smile on his face. "He was right, Senna. This is the treasure he told you about, and all you have to do is take it from me." Had it been a normal situation, then Senna would have surely accepted without hesitation. But he knew what he allegedly was facing. His face looked a bit puzzled, but also worried. "Do I happen to know you?" he asked cautiously. "I know of you," Kane answered. His voice sounded as cold as the winds out here. The polite and friendly demeanor that he had shown in the tavern was now gone. "I know that you have been this place before, 3 years ago, at a farm a bit south from here, that you pillaged before you burned it to the ground and killed everybody there." "3 years ago?" Senna snorted. "That was nothing. Worthless peasants led by an old woman who was just too stubborn to—" He would never finish that sentence. The blade of Kane's sword came out of the sheath that he had been holding this entire time. It sang as it cut through the air in one swift move. Sang almost like Royaka performed one of her songs, but it sang a song of death. As the sword hit flesh, the song changed to something even darker, and when it had made its cut, it was resting in Kane's hand, pointing away from his body at the end of a white bow, with red blood dripping from the blade that seemed as black as night, in contrast to the silver grip that Kane firmly held in his hand. "She was my mother, you bastard." Senna would never answer to that, never utter one more word ever again. In shock and terror he looked at Kane, until his legs gave in and he fell to the floor, with a large slash wound on his torso that let out gallons of his life juice. His eyes looked upwards to the man that had struck him, but his gaze soon faded away, and he passed his last breath. It was the only sound, apart from the slight breeze of wind around his place, and the creaking of a tavern sign. The rest was silence, deadly, terrifying silence. Mavella couldn't really believe what just happened here. Nobody could. The armed man in front of them looked in shock at what had been their leader, and at the person who stood above him with a bloodied sword. The peasants next to Mavella didn't even dare to breathe at this moment. As if this entire moment had been frozen in time, everybody just stood there, trying to process what they just had witnessed. The tavern sign swung in the wind and creaked one more time. It sounded like a battle cry. So, is anyone still awake here? Are you with me? I hope you're enjoying it so far. We are only 2 chapters away from the end of part 1. This is where I would make a cut, and I'm still in the mood of reading on. So if you want to hear more, I'll be happy to oblige. Okay. All right, Annika. Good. Then let's get on with chapter 6, the battle tune. A loud shout cut through the silence in this village. As they saw their leader being killed by Cain, they let out a shout of rage, started by one, joined in by the others. They raised their weapons, screamed their lungs out, and began to charge. They were determined to avenge their man, even though they knew that they were running into their own demise. The archers began to fire. Mavella couldn't react quickly enough as she had heard the bowstrings send their arrows on their way. But Cain's reflexes worked. One arrow passed him as he dodged it, flew right past his head, and hit a small basket that was lying around near the tavern wall. The other one came right at him. With one swift move he brought the blade of his sword just right into the right spot, deflecting the arrow, nearly cutting the shaft apart. It flew into the darkness, never to be seen again. The 2 men with the throwing knives tried their luck too, but Cain parried those whirling blades coming towards him with ease. The metal knives hit his dark blade with a high-pitched sound. The rest of the men, all armed with melee weapons, would still need another moment or 2 before they reached him. Mavella stood there, watching all this, unsure whether she was supposed to get involved or not. This was a personal matter for Cain, and he seemed to know what he was doing. This was not her fight. But suddenly she remembered something. The silver that he had given them. It looked like everything he had owned. Like he won't be needing it anymore. Once that thought had crossed her mind, Mavella's instincts made her act immediately. The first archer had pulled out another arrow and readied it, but the bolt from her crossbow shot through the air, hitting him in the chest before he could fire. It was a signal. The peasants around her let out a scream similar to the one of the attackers. They stormed the field and ran to the enemy. Mavella was aghast. Those peasants were outnumbered, poorly armed and equipped. It would be a massacre. Once the first of them fell, the others would lose their courage, would either flee or die themselves. Mavella grabbed her sword faster and ran onto the battlefield with the others. The warriors on horseback had been waiting while the men on foot charged. Now they moved their horses and began to charge themselves. In her back, Mavella heard something, a sound that she wasn't expecting to hear in the midst of a battle. The soft tone of a wooden flute. The first attackers had come close enough to attack Cain, and did so. The rest of them were still charging, but they saw the peasants coming towards them, and for a moment it gave them pause. Mavella was more worried about the mounted attackers, though. The speed of their horses, combined with the fact that their weapons were more effective than those wielded by the footmen, made them deadly opponents. and she was worried what damage they could deal if they hit the peasants. She had to do something about it. Cain moved again. His moves seemed restrained, focused, following a strange pattern that Mavella had never seen in a sword fight before, as if he knew perfectly well where to place his attacks and when to strike. His sword danced in his hand, cutting and slicing through the enemy, blocking attacks from them and striking back almost at the same time. From this first wave of attackers, 2 men were already dead on the ground, before even the first rider had reached him. A third one was still standing, swinging what looked like a battle axe in poor condition, missed him, and received the dark blade of Cain's sword in his ribs for the trouble. They were still too many, especially the riders. The first one came close enough, already with his weapon raised to strike Cain down. His horse galloped towards him, with no sign of stopping, and Cain had to know that he didn't stand a chance. He saw him coming and jumped to the side, evading the attack by a hairbreadth. The peasants were close behind him now, but the rider didn't stop. The horse went on, right into the middle of the peasants. Mavella could not turn around to see what happened back there, but she heard the scream of fear and pain that the peasants uttered, mixed in with the horse's neighing and an outcry from its rider, who kept on hitting against anyone who would come into his reach. It was in that moment, signaled by the fearsome cries of the villagers, that their courage was lost, and they started to run. She knew that. She had expected that from the beginning. Right now there was nothing she could do about it. The first attackers had reached her, and she had to defend herself. She went into a defensive stance, holding up her sword in one hand. The first one to engage her was a man with a spear-like weapon, thrusting it at her chest. This was easy to handle. She moved a bit to the side, struck the shaft of the spear with her sword, deflected the attack. As the pointy end of it was past her, the weapon posed no threat to her anymore. With a mighty swing she went for her opponent's head, and succeeded. The blade slashed his throat, let him go down gurgling. Even if he survived that, he wouldn't be fighting anymore. The next attacker wasn't so easy to handle. The way she wielded his broadsword showed Mavella that he had actually received some training. Also, he didn't blindly charge at her and left her an opening, but struck from a safe stance, ready to do damage, but also to defend it against a counterattack. Mavella had to parry, and the loud clash of their swords sounded across the entire village. Before he could strike again, Mavella tried to push him out of balance, hoping that an opening turned up for her to exploit. He wouldn't give her one. He struggled to keep on his feet as Mavella gave him the push, but he managed to do so. Mavella tried to land her attack anyway, a horizontal blow that should hit his chest. He parried it with ease, struck back almost immediately. As Mavella defended herself, she saw in the background that the rest of the enemies were focusing on attacking Cain, while the riders charged for the fleeing peasants. She couldn't see what had happened to Cain and Oyeka, and she didn't have time to think about either of them. Right now she had to fight for her own life. Her sword parried the next attack, and in an act of desperation she went all offense. She stepped forward, slashed at her enemy with all her might, trying to break his defense. This couldn't be happening. Some shabby bandit or deserter from the army, beating her in combat. Her, a knight of a king. Her training should not allow that. She had been fighting in battles greater and harder than this one, and he was the only one facing her right now. It was not like she was in Cain's position, having to fight half an army at once. She needed to focus just for that one moment and remember all the lessons and battles of her past. But she was wrong about one thing. He wasn't the only one facing off against her. She felt the attack with the axe more than she actually saw it, and pure instinct saved her life in that moment. She ducked under the large blade of the axe that missed her for not even an inch, all while she tried to hold off against the broadsword fighter. The new opponent came from her left, her weak side. But that was something that she remembered from her combat training. When the other enemy raised the sword again to strike, she turned her sword in her hand so that the blade pointed downwards, not upwards. She awaited the inevitable attack. And it came. It was a thrust, aiming for her neck. As she turned around quickly, her sword sliding against the enemy blade as she parried it, she turned it again. The thrust was forcefully redirected into the chest of the Axeman. Her opponent had to be shocked about the outcome of this attack, but Mavella didn't intend to let him recover from that. With a swift slash, she ended his life before he could manage to pull his weapon out of the body of his companion. It gave her one tiny little moment of peace in all this chaos, and she took a quick glance at Royeka. The young woman stood in the background, still accompanied by the innkeeper, who had his weapon in both hands, but seemed hesitant to use it. Her worried gaze met Mavella's, and it was clear that Royeka wanted to help her. But there was nothing she could do now, was there? The neighing of horses had Mavella turned around to the front again. Since the peasants were about to be scattered and mowed down, the other riders joined in on the attack while the footmen tried their hardest to defeat Cain on even ground. A couple more of them were dead on the ground already, but the rest had apparently learned their lesson. They formed a half-circle around Cain, using pole arms to keep him at bay. His sword-fighting moves were still impressive, but ineffective since he wasn't able to reach anyone with it. Mavella had no choice. Even if they killed Cain, nobody said that they would stop. For her own sake, for the sake of the villagers and her best friend, she had to help him, even if they still outnumbered her 6-1. They saw her coming. Two of them turned around with shorter weapons like swords and axes in their hands, as opposed to the ones with the pole arms. Mavella had to get past them. She needed to create an opening for Cain, so that he could go into the offense himself. But both men saw her coming, raising their weapons, prepared for a charge. And this time it wouldn't be as easy as with the other two. Suddenly, a voice was heard, a female voice, a singing voice. It filled the entire battlefield with sweet music, echoed in Mavella's ears. Stand my ground, I won't give in. It happened to the perfect time, while Mavella was in the perfect place. She felt the music reaching out to every muscle in her body, reaching into her mind, giving her courage and confidence. She saw her two opponents coming at her, saw the attack they both prepared, but it was like everything happened while they were trapped in thick syrup. She swung her sword, missing the weapon of her first enemy, but hitting the man that wielded it. The second one missed her with his strike, and in one fluent move she pulled her blade out of the first one to sink it into the flesh of the second. And the way was clear. No more denying. I've got to face it. Royeka gave her singing voice so much power that Mavella felt like the world was shaking from it. The enemies had to feel it too, and even in the thick of the battle, she could see enough of their faces to notice the uncertainty, the insecurity, the hesitation that would seal their fate. All the bravery they had rallied to fight a Levi. According to legends, they were masters of a sword fight, nigh undefeatable. Wasn't holding up against both a Levi and a royal knight attacking them with a battle tune of a bard in their back. Won't close my eyes and hide the truth inside. One swift blow which her enemy was not quick enough to dodge or defend against. The polearm that had kept Cain at bay dropped to the ground. Cain saw the opportunity and made use of it. His blade was hard to see in the dark of the night, but even in broad daylight Mavella would have had trouble following its movements as it cut and sliced through the enemies. 1 second later she found herself fighting back to back with Cain, driving off what was left of their opposition, scattering the rest of the bandits like they did with the peasants, until the horsemen came back into the fight. The neighing of the horses was the only warning. Mavella had to drop to the ground as the first rider reached her, swung his weapon to hit her in the head. She fell and was lucky enough to not get trampled by the horses in the process. But then she looked back in the direction the rider had come from, and saw the other 3 horsemen coming towards her. The horses galloped, their hoofs made the ground shake, and Mavella knew that there was nothing she could do in this moment. The ground shook even harder as they closed in on her, and then it hit them. Mavella couldn't believe their eyes. Couldn't believe her eyes. It's my mistake. Mavella couldn't believe her eyes. It looked like the ground itself raced against them for a fraction of a second, blocking the horses' path, driving them to a screeching halt. Their riders could not brace for their sudden stop, and were thrown off, landing on the ground right next to Mavella and Kane. The hooded man reacted quickly, although he was also lying on the ground, but he stabbed the first rider with his sword before the other could recover from his fall. Mavella rushed back on her feet more quickly than her enemies did, but she knew that the fight was over by now. The horses retreated from the battlefield, snickering nervously after what they had encountered. The riders had dropped their weapons while they were thrown off and weren't able to reach them in time. The remaining footmen, few of them there were chased out by the peasants, who were also encouraged by Royeka's battle song. The only real opponent on the field was the rider. Sorry, I think I better take a sip to drink. I mean, this is a bit exhausting. It's not my native language. I see that. The only real opponent on the field was the rider that had attacked Mavella. It was Norg, the one that had spoken up first and had recognized Kane for what he was. And he knew that he was beaten. "This is not worth dying for," he grumbled between clenched teeth. He turned his horse around and galloped away without looking back. Mavella let out a relieved sigh. The 2 remaining riders were defeated. They got on their knees with their hands raised, surrendering to them. Kane stood up slowly, with his sword still in his hand. He approached them slowly, and Mavella could only guess what his intention was. But before she could say anything, he had raised the weapon over his head, ready to strike both men down in cold blood. "Kane, stop!" Oyeka had stepped forward too. She had lost her singing voice. Mavella noticed that the melody still seemed to resonate in her soul, but most of it was gone. Still, Oyeka had some authority in her voice that surprised her. She walked towards Kane, looking him firmly in the eyes, raising one hand to soothe him. "You mustn't do this," she said to him. An urging, almost pleading tone accompanied these words. "The fight is over. There's been enough bloodshed already." Kane wouldn't listen. He tightened his grip around his sword. "Not for me, it hasn't," he replied, sounding of anger and hate. He raised it again. The man stared at him in fear. "Stop!" Oyeka's voice was like the crack of a whip going down on the man. It made the entire village go silent again, and it actually made him pause. "Look around you. Look at all the people who have died already. How is that not enough?" "They destroyed my home." Kane's voice was an angry growl. "They killed my family and my friends. They need to pay." "They have paid," Oyeka reminded him. "They have paid with the lives of their friends. They have nothing left now. You won't gain anything from killing them." She tilted her head, looked at him as if she examined him. "Is it true? Are you a Levi?" Her voice had softened. Kane looked back at her. Mabella sensed his insecurity in this moment. I am, he confirmed. Is that the way of your people? Royaka kept this question lingering over him and the entire battlefield. But one look in her face, and Mavella knew that she had won. Slowly, hesitantly, as if his own demons were struggling inside him, Cain lowered the sword again. He turned his attention to the two men. You, leave your weapons and go. Don't ever come back here. Now run, before I change my mind. He let them stand up, and thankfully the two men started running. And this is the end of chapter 6. So, one more chapter and we are done for the night. Just taking a little refreshment before we continue. I hope you could understand most of it. I think even I didn't understand everything I just read, so at least I wouldn't have if I hadn't the text right in front of me, so yeah. To me, it's much easier reading it in German. Okay, chapter 7 The Swordsman. 2 villagers had died. One had been trampled to death by a horse, the other one had been beaten down in the street. The villagers mourned their loss, but they were still grateful. Hadn't it been for these 3 adventurers that just happened to take a rest in their village, they all would have been much worse off. They obviously hadn't heard Cain's words before the battle had begun. If it weren't for Cain, none of this would have happened. Either they didn't hear, or they forgave him since he had been one of them, living in that farmhouse that Mavella and Royeka had passed. Mavella started to notice something that she hadn't before. The way the peasants treated Cain. Cautious, with respect, sure, but a little different than she and Royeka were treated. They showed a certain familiarity with his map. Then again, before the battle it had been hard to tell one from another, since he had been sitting in a corner sipping from his mug. He had gone back to doing that again now. After everything in the streets had been taken care of, all the weapons and horses remaining had been gathered and put in a safe place, all the dead had been picked up and carried away, everyone left standing met in the tavern again, celebrating their victory or the simple fact that they survived. The innkeeper, whose name turned out to be Brown, no relation to our admin, by the way, gave out a free round of drinks. Cain kept sitting in his corner, all by himself. Mavella sat across Royeka at their old table, and she looked at her friend worriedly. Royeka had acted like nothing was wrong when they still were outside, but now that she was seated again, her act fell off of her like torn up clothing. She was exhausted, pale, and in pain. Mavella had seen this before, and she didn't like it. Maybe there was some truth to what Royeka had once said, that Mavella acted like her mother. Mavella felt like one at times, and she didn't want to see Royeka get hurt. She wanted to protect her, although Royeka was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. But maybe after this one fateful night, Royeka couldn't help herself. She remembered the fear of losing her best friend, and she didn't want to go through this ever again. With a few deep breaths, a large sip of wine from her mug, and a bit of silence in which Royeka just sat there, with her eyes closed and one hand holding her stomach like something was rampaging in it, it apparently got better. She opened her eyes again, and turned back into her old Royeka self. She even showed a little smile, but it looked a bit forced. What happened? Mabella wanted to know. She showed a frown instead of a smile. Hoyeka shrugged. The usual. It wasn't a real answer, especially not after what happened, and they both knew it. This wasn't usual. Hoyeka had used powers before, powers that were a danger to herself even more than they were to others. Back then on the river, the use of her powers had had some devastating effect on the ones that had tried to cross them. But at least Hoyeka got out of there mostly unharmed. Why was now different? She hadn't even killed someone. Mavella realized that she probably would never understand how this magic worked. She would never understand those gods behind the magic and the rules involved in using this power. And she didn't want to. While she was pondering, Oyeka finally decided to give a proper answer. I didn't defend myself. I used the magic without my life being in danger. The frown turned into a grim and angry look on Mavella's face. Why would it make a difference? Yes, Hoyeka wasn't defending herself. She was defending Mavella, saving her life. That should count for something, at least. It just does. Hoyeka leaned back and obviously didn't want to discuss it any further. The noise in the tavern had lowered to a steady, but a lot quieter background mix of chatter and laughter. There was a different mood in here than before the fight, even than before Hoyeka's bark performance. Mavella looked around. Her gaze found Kane. Excuse me for a moment, she grumbled and stood up from the table. Hoyeka got up as well. What are you going to do? Fight him? Her sarcasm cut like a blade. Mavella flinched. What is that going to achieve now? Besides, he's probably as done for as the two of us. Some of the tension that Mavella felt now left her. Hoyeka was right, but still. I want to know why, Mavella whispered. Why he did this. Why he endangered all those innocent people. All right then. Hoyeka's answer came so quick that it surprised Mavella, even more than the fact that her friend didn't try to talk her out of this. Then let me do the talking. You just sit there and look intimidating. That's what you're best at. Any other person would have reacted to that snarky comment at the end, but Mavella could only agree with her. That was more or less the entire point. To, dis- to, discover, to discourage other people from engaging her in any unwanted way. Her army training had furthered this too. Showing potential enemies from the beginning what they had to deal with helped with ending fights before they even began. Nobody would want to get entangled with a Knight of a King. So Hoyeka had a point there. Even though Mavella doubted that Kane would be that much impressed, given that he was allegedly a sword master. They approached his table, their mugs in their hands, and sat down on two empty stools without him inviting them. Kane noticed their somewhat rude behavior and raised an eyebrow. His hood was now down at least, showing everyone his entire face. No shadows in which he could hide any more. He looked at both at them. He looked at both of them, but he said nothing. We saved our life. We saved your life out there, Hoyeka said to him, far more calmly than Mavella would have been able to. The least you owe us is an explanation. Just a second. As Kane didn't answer, but silently drank from his wine, Mavella added in, Those bandits would have cut you into pieces if we hadn't intervened. But that was the point, wasn't it? Mavella turned around, looking at Hoyeka in shock. That was pretty blunt of her. Blunt, but insightful. Kane seemed to sink in, shrink right before them. His face was a dark mask, but the pain that he felt was shining through. Again, she thought back to the purse with the silver. What will you do now? Oyeka's voice had gone soft again. If she was angry or disappointed in any way, affected by what he had done, then nobody would be able to tell. She spoke to him like she would to a child. Kane sat there, stared into nowhere, before he finally shrugged. Actually, I haven't given it much thought. That much was obvious. Mavella looked back at Oyeka, seeing this idea glimmering up in her eyes. What about settling down here? She then asked, trying to change the subject before Oyeka could put this idea of hers into words. Rebuilding your farm. I mean, it is yours now, isn't it? I guess so, Kane admitted, but I'm not much of a farmer. Besides, this would always remind me of. He didn't speak on. He didn't have to. It was obvious, the grief and sorrow he felt right now. But there was something else. Even Vella could see it. A hint of guilt. What happened? She asked. Now she was really curious. Kane turned to her slowly. I failed. That's what happened, he answered. I went into war, wanted to serve a king like everyone else. I wanted to defend my country, my kingdom. He scoffed bitterly. But I couldn't even defend the ones I loved. They were killed while I was away, looking for personal glory. Had I stayed here, none of this would have happened. Or you might have gotten yourself killed as well, Mavella thought. It wasn't the first time she saw someone like Kane doubt themselves or their decisions. Many young soldiers had left their homes to fight for their king, maybe also fight for glory or honor, but when they returned back home, what they found was more than often not the same as what they had left. It wasn't always as bad as with Kane, but there had been raiding parties all over the country, bandits, deserters, ruffians who took what they pleased because there was no army to stop them. The equipment of the men they had fought suggested that much. They must have roamed the country for some time now, if 3 years ago they had burned down the farm. Oyeka opened her mouth to say something. Mavella quickly grabbed her by the wrist. Excuse us for a moment, she said to Kane, and dragged her friend away from the table, out of hearing range. What in the name of? Oyeka protested, trying to keep her voice down, but was still infuriated. But Mavella cut her off. I know what you're about to say. I'm gonna say this. No. No way. Don't even think about it. You are going to take this idea and knock it right out of your head, Oyeka. Right now. He's a Levi, Oyeka reminded. I don't give a fiery damn that he's a Levi. I don't trust him. He led a raiding party to his own home village just to avenge himself on them. He put innocent villagers at risk for his petty revenge. And if we hadn't been there, he would be dead, I know, and that is exactly my point. Oyeka pulled her a little more aside, into a corner, so that nobody could hear what they were discussing. He's a Levi. He's bound by a code that the Order taught him. He's supposed to be one of the good guys, and we both have seen him fight. He could be helpful on our quest. With a side glance to the man, she added, Plus, we helped him. He's in our debt. You're not going to tell him about it, are you? Mavella asked distrustful. You told me that this is forbidden law. I don't think we have much of a choice in this. Sometimes Oyeka was surprisingly calm and calculated. No matter what we will be facing on our journey, it will be too much for you and me alone to handle. You think this attack on the ferry was the worst of it? You have been there with me, Mavella. You know what happened to our home. Mavella knew what had happened, and she knew what had caused this. At least, she had a good idea. She didn't really know what they had been, but she had seen what they could do, and if they continued on their journey, which was the only option, as she knew, when chances were high that we would run into them again sooner or later. Even he can't do much against them, she mumbled, no matter how good he is. And still, a code of honor is no guarantee that he will abide it. My powers are growing, Oyeka said, again in a calm voice, almost as a side note. She let Mavella figure out the true meaning of this on her own. And she did. What? That's. She figured it out, but she couldn't put it into words. She knew this was big. Bigger than any of them. And Oyeka put it into words for her. What we are doing right now is so important that even Elstar wants us to succeed. Whatever influence she has on this world, she will use it, through me. I know what I can do when she grants me the full magnitude of her power. But still, we will need help. And he is a sword master, trained by the best, and his task is to fight for the good cause. Whether you like it or not, we need him. No, Mavella really didn't like it. She hated the idea of a stranger joining them on their journey, especially a stranger that she might not be able to defeat in combat should he turn on them. At the beginning of his quest, when they had been basically thrown into the situation without any warning, she always thought that the two of them would be enough to conquer the world, or at least save it. And who else was there to trust but them? Their families were dead, their friends had perished. Mavella's brothers and sisters in arms were fighting on the far sides of the kingdom, unable to help them. And even if she put trust into someone to help them, there was always a chance that they would be betrayed. The events on the ferry were proof to that. Why would this be any different? Because of some code that happened to Mavella. Because of some code that Mavella and Oyeka only knew from lore and legends, because of some romantic assumption that this man at the table was some kind of hero. He could fight. Mavella gave him that. That was not enough reason to put their lives into his hands. All those thoughts and worries would not convince Oyeka, she knew. And for one simple reason. Oyeka was right, once again. He makes one false move and I run him through with my blade, she grumbled as a warning. Oyeka grinned. That was a Mavella she knew and loved. As long as you don't run him through before that. Then they went back on the Then they went back to the table and sat down with Kane. Brown had brought new mugs and a bottle of what he said was the best mead he had in store. He had been saving this particular bottle for a special occasion, and it was just right to give it to the saviors of his village. Mavella opened the bottle and filled their mugs. They had a lot to discuss now. And that, my friends and fellow readers and my fellow audience, would be the end of part 1. I can stop now.